Now, a very important question, of course, is whether or not GDP is a good indicator for development. On this slide, you can see a world map which shows the gross domestic product in different countries. The GDP here is shown in terms of colors. So those countries which are in a dark red color are countries with a relatively high GDP. And those countries with a relatively light red color are countries with a low GDP. And you can observe some interesting things here. There are two countries which seem to stand out, which seem to be quite different from the other countries. Those are the United States of America and China. Those two countries are the two countries with the highest GDP in the world. The USA is the country with the highest GDP because it has a very dark red color, and China is in the second place, second highest GDP in the world. Thailand, you can see it has a relatively light red color, has a relatively low GDP. Also, a country like Sweden has a low GDP, similar to the GDP of Thailand. France also has a relatively low GDP, also similar to that of Thailand. Now, based on this map, do you think that GDP is a good indicator for the level of development of a country? Would you say that the United States of America and China are the most developed countries in the world? Because if you would use GDP as an indicator for development, you would need to say that because the United States of America and China have the highest GDP in the world, they are the most developed countries in the world. Probably your answer is no. Because actually there are many more countries who are highly developed. And in particular, there are actually more countries who are more developed than China. Of course, China is a very big country, but actually many European countries like Sweden, like France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, and so on, also a country like Australia, are considered to be more developed than China. Also, if you compare countries in Southeast Asia, you would see that Thailand seems to have about the same GDP like Laos. So Thailand and Laos have the same level of development according to the indicator GDP. And that's of course also not true. Actually, Thailand is more developed than Laos. So we can see that GDP is really not a good indicator for the development level of a country. Actually, we can say that GDP is not a measure for the development level of a country, but it's a measure of the scale of a country's economy. So the bigger the economy of a country, the bigger the GDP. And the United States of America and China have a very, very big economy. And therefore, the GDP is also largest in these two countries. What GDP does not do is it does not take into account the population size of the country. Of course, China has a huge population. It has the largest population in the world. More than 1 billion people are living in China. Compare that to a country in Europe, for example, like Sweden. Sweden is a relatively small country in terms of population. It has maybe 20 million inhabitants, something like that, or 30 million. And because of this difference in population size, China has a much higher GDP than Sweden, because there are many more people, and all of these people are contributing to the production in China. So the more people, the more you can produce, mostly. And this is the reason why China has such a large GDP, because it has such a huge population size. So countries with a larger population tend to have a higher GDP than countries with a smaller population. Of course, there are some exceptions. Even a country with a smaller population can have a higher GDP than a country with a bigger population if the people of the country with a smaller population are able to produce more than the people of the country with a bigger population. But those are exceptions. If we look at the general tendency, the overall tendency, we can say that countries with a larger population have a higher GDP than countries with a smaller population. So we need to find a better indicator for development than GDP. And there's a very simple one, which is called GDP per capita. GDP per capita is simply GDP divided by population size. And by dividing GDP by population size, this indicator controls for the size of the population of a country. And because of that, GDP per capita can be used in order to directly compare countries with larger populations with countries with smaller populations. We can see that very clearly if we look at the same map again, but this time the map shows GDP per capita by country. And you can see that the colors have changed quite a lot. You can see now that the United States of America are still one of the countries with the highest GDP per capita now. But other countries with a very high GDP per capita are countries like Canada, many countries in Europe, like France, the UK, Germany, a country like Australia, also a country like Japan. And those are the countries that are usually regarded as highly developed countries. So we can see that GDP per capita is a better indicator for the development level of a country. You can also see now that China is not anymore among the countries with the highest GDP. It has one of the highest GDPs, but it has not a very high GDP per capita. GDP per capita in China is relatively low.